We're going to continue where we left off last week, and you can throw the title slide up, and then I should be able to control the rest. We're continuing with this message, Breaking the Law, Breaking the Law. And so today, my message is entitled, Still Breaking the Law. The tone of Matthew's gospel has changed when Jesus declared that he brings something that is light and easy. We saw last week that Jesus did not break the law, that Jesus did break the law of Moses. He does not deny it. And in this case, it's the Sabbath. But with his first explicit miracle that is recorded in Matthew's gospel, he broke the law by laying hands on an unhealed leper. Often he's defended today with saying that he broke the extra laws of the Pharisees that they had added on to the law of Moses. But he didn't break the law of Moses, and this makes Jesus the sinless sacrifice. But then, how can we say that keeping the law makes Jesus perfect, the sinless sacrifice, when the book of Hebrews tells us the law makes nothing perfect? We saw that Jesus doesn't deny breaking the law of Moses. Rather, he places himself alongside other lawbreakers, including David and the priests. He'll also use the same Greek word for work that he is doing on the Sabbath that the Jewish Greek First Testament says can't be done on the Sabbath. Jesus says that work thing that is against the law of Moses, my Father's always working, and so am I. I too will work on the Sabbath. And then we saw that the Apostle John says that Jesus was breaking the law of Moses. The two facts that John gives us about Jesus as to why the Jewish leaders sought to kill him was that Jesus made himself equal to God, and Jesus was breaking the law of Moses. So Jesus is breaking the law, but he tells the Pharisees, you can break the law, but be guiltless, because the law of Moses does not condemn us. Being unmerciful condemns us. Not treating others as we want to be treated condemns us. That condemns us. And we read in Scripture that we are judged in the manner that we judge others. So the Mosaic Law is broken by Jesus, it's broken by others, yet they're guiltless. And Jesus says that the Pharisees and us would understand this if we would understand what it means in Hosea that God says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. The Greek for desires here is not simply wishes. I wish for mercy. It's a beautiful wish, and it's a great dream. It's a pipe dream. The Greek word here for desires is to purpose, to intend. It's an active word. It's not a passive wish. And so Jesus has sent them to the turning point in their own scriptures with Hosea. And we see phases through the Old Testament of the sacrifices, of the understanding of sacrifices in the Old Testament. And we'll go to the first slide. It's a little small, but I'll walk you through it. And so the phases, my apologies. I didn't test it on this, so anyway, I'll walk you through it. The phases of sacrifices. God says, I want mercy and not sacrifices. The phases of sacrifices in an understanding through the First Testament begins in Genesis to Deuteronomy. It's the Pentateuch. It's the earliest understanding. It's the oldest understanding. And we read there that God spoke. The Hebrew is dibar. And God commanded sivah, sacrifices and burnt offerings, which would then soothe and appease him, very much like the pagan gods. By David's time, that is at least a couple hundred years later, Samuel and David declare that God is not pleased with sacrifices. In his Psalms, David says that God neither wants or requires sacrifices or burnt offerings. And in fact, as the Jews developed their Greek translation of the First Testament, a translation that began to be made about 300 years before Jesus' ministry. In the Greek translation, they translate David as saying that God did not even command sacrifices. Then we move to the prophets. This is 200 to 300 more years. Isaiah, Hosea, and Jeremiah, they make clear to the people that God does not delight in sacrifices. He didn't want them. They do not soothe him. They do not appease him. And Jeremiah is the last one to prophesy about this. And his prophecy aligns with the Greek translation of David that God never commanded sacrifices and burnt offerings. In the Hebrew, Jeremiah literally says the same words ascribed to God before. Jeremiah says, God never said that. And in the Jews' Greek translation a few hundred years before Jesus, they have the same thing, the same words. And so Jeremiah says God never debared, he never spoke, he never seva, he never commanded these sacrifices. Jeremiah pushes back against it. And the question can become then, what happened that made Israel go down that road back in the Pentateuch before things started to shift? Continuing in the Greek translation of Jeremiah, I think it says it best, we find our answer. Jeremiah says here in Jeremiah 7:24, and they did not hear me or pay attention with their ear, but they walked in the thoughts of their incapable hearts. In this section, God says, I never spoke, I never commanded these things, but you didn't get it because you didn't listen to me, you listened to your hearts that we're incapable of fully understanding. And God says, I never command these things, I never told you to give these things, these burnt offerings and these sacrifices. Those were walked out and thought out by your hearts. Hearts that were shaped by your ancient world culture of gods whose default position towards humanity is wrath and annoyance. The default position of the gods in the ancient world was wrath and annoyance unless humanity worked really hard to overcome their default disposition. Humanity had to work really hard to appease and soothe the gods through sacrifices. And the view was that the shortcoming was on our end, not God's. The theme through Hebrews is that our conscience, though, is the problem. The problem is not with God. The book of Hebrews tells us that the Jewish people gave sacrifices, but they could not make the human conscience feel clean and free. And the Jews kept feeling the need to give sacrifices year after year. And it only reminded them even more, year after year, of their sinfulness. And so in comes Jesus. And Hebrews 7 tells us that Jesus came as a priest by oath, not by the law. There's an oath in the Psalms that is pointed to that prescribed Jesus to be a priest. And Jesus comes from the order of Melchizedek rather than the order of Aaron. And Jesus wasn't even sacrificed where and how the law of Moses needed sacrifices to be made. So Jesus is this wild card from outside the Mosaic Law in his life and in his death. He is one whom Hebrews says has brought his own law. Hebrews says that a different priesthood involves a different law. The Mosaic Law was tainted by us, humanity. Jeremiah says it was your hearts. We attempted to reconcile God to us by appeasing him and soothing him with what we thought he liked. But really, God says, since the Garden of Eden. It was your heart, it was your conscience that put you behind the tree from me. I came after you and I never stopped. The problem is not with me. It's inside of you. So in Jesus, God came to our side of the tree. And as Jesus, God climbs onto the tree that we keep putting between us and God. And Jesus sacrifices himself on the tree that we use to try to divide ourselves from God. The cross begins as the tree that we would humanity would once again use it to separate ourselves from a God who is too good. But the tree of the cross, by which we would send God back out of our world to again gain separation from him. The tree of the cross, the tree of division that dates all the way back to Eden. Jesus turns the tree of separation into the tree of life. And God declares through Jesus that no matter what it costs, I will be found with you, even in the instrument by which you seek to cause separation from me. I will now put myself into that instrument. And even in the Mosaic Law, the instrument by which you perceived and measured distance from me. I will come from outside the law, but I will come to it. And I'll be found there as well. And in his work, Jesus comes through the barriers to connect to the real issue. It's the issue of our hearts and our conscience. Even the law of Moses, it saw the problem as being on God's end. God must stay away from us. The problem is to him, and so we have to solve God's problem through sacrifices and appease him and keep him reconciled. We have to keep God reconciled to us through our sacrifices. But God in Jesus says, I've always been reconciled to you. You have not gotten it. Since the garden, I put no tree between us, you did. I've always been reconciled to you, and so I will come to your side of the tree. I will let you nail me to it. And while you nail me to it, I will speak the words of forgiveness that cancel all the debt you think I am holding over your head. And as you nail me to the tree, I will nail to the tree all the canceled notices since the beginning of time and for all time. All the notices of debt. And as I do this, as I come and make a public spectacle of myself upon the tree of division, and as I only speak forgiveness to even my murderers, I invite your hearts and consciences to be cleansed once and for all when you see truly and fully who I am. And may you be reconciled to me, just as I've always been reconciled to you. And Jesus says, you Pharisees would have begun to understand this if you would have dug into what it means that I will. My will is for mercy. My purpose is for mercy, not sacrifice. And so on this point, Jesus, the Mosaic lawbreaker, he moves on. And we read in Matthew 12:9. He left that place and entered their synagogue. As we have seen in Matthew, Jesus comes from the outside in. Jesus is first found beyond the realm of the lepers. Jesus has to walk towards the center to even begin to encounter a leper. He is found from the furthest theological point away from the temple within which the Jews thought they had boxed God in. Matthew maintains this religious distance between Jesus and the religious establishment. The temple will be seen as Jesus coming to the final boss level, to use a video game analogy. The temple is seen as the perverted heart of Jesus' religious enemies. The synagogues, which have spread out through the land, are the tendrils of perversion that come out from the temple. And if you haven't picked it up yet in our study on Matthew, every time Jesus enters a synagogue, Matthew calls it their synagogue. There's 4 times: Matthew 4:23, 9:35, 12:9, and 13:54. It is their synagogue that I come to. The synagogues are the home turf of Jesus' enemies. And it is on their turf, as the tone of things have changed, that the Pharisees are going to press their confrontation with Jesus to the next level. And so we come to our second confrontation of Matthew 12. It begins when there's a man in their synagogue service. It was their version of a church service. It begins when there's a man there with a damaged hand. And now the Pharisees are on the attack. They want to accuse Jesus in the presence of their own followers who are gathered on their turf. They want to shame Jesus in front of others. So having observed who Jesus is, with his love and charity, they set him up. They are no longer reactive to what Jesus is doing, but for the first time, they pick up the initiative to test Jesus and to try to set him up for public failure. As the man sits there with his broken hand, they ask Jesus, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" The word cure here is not even about healing. The word is simply about lending aid in a moment of need. So they're asking, is it lawful to lend aid on the Sabbath? Their question to Jesus is, apparently you have the ability to help this man. There's a man in need who needs his hand fixed, and you have the ability, but is it lawful to assist a need on the Sabbath? Now, Jesus had just reasoned with the Pharisees based upon what they were supposed to go and learn about who God is. The God who Jesus is revealing to them. Jesus has placed himself as God over the law, and therefore carrying within himself a greater law. As Hebrews calls it, a different law of the Jesus priesthood, of the Melchizedek priesthood. Jesus has said, you were supposed to go and learn who God is, a God who says mercy and not sacrifice. But now I'll take a different route. Rather than appeal again to Hosea, I will now appeal to whom God has made all of us with simple common sense. So Jesus, typical for him, doesn't directly answer their question right off. He asks a question in return. In Matthew 12:11, he says, suppose one of you had only one sheep. It is the only sheep you own. Makes it more valuable and makes you probably very poor. This is it. This is the sheep that you own, and it falls in a pit on the Sabbath. Are you not going to rescue it? There's a record in the Dead Sea Scrolls leading up to Jesus' day that it was not permissible to help an animal give birth if they went into labor on the Sabbath. And specific to Jesus' question, they had a rule that you could not rescue an animal that falls into a pit on the Sabbath. But Jesus ups the ante from moving it from an animal among many that you own to something of more value. Your only animal, your only sheep, would you rescue it? Common sense. The way we are wired, the way God has made us, says, yes, of course I'm going to rescue the only sheep I have because it is too valuable to let die on the Sabbath. So, Jesus says, in his appeal to common sense that God has given us, how much more then should you aid any human being who is in need? Humans are all the more valuable than an only sheep. Therefore, Jesus goes on, and he now offers a rare, direct answer to a question. Jesus says, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And the question becomes, wait, Jesus, if you just admitted that you're breaking Moses' law through your merciful work on the Sabbath, if you've gone and broken his law by touching a leper, if you admit to not following the law, then by which law is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? The answer is by the law of common sense as God made us. It is lawful by the law of mercy, not sacrifice. It is lawful by the law of the priesthood of Jesus and Melchizedek that is outside the system of Aaron. To prove his point that he has authority in this matter, Jesus then heals the man's hand. And we read on. But the Pharisees went out and they conspired against him, how to destroy him. Having been thoroughly embarrassed on their home turf now, the Pharisees retreat. Verse 9 said that Jesus entered into their synagogue. But who ends up having to leave? It's the Pharisees who must go out because Jesus has won the day. He has won over the crowd. And the Pharisees no longer seek to simply undermine and refute Jesus. They now move to kill him, to destroy him. Probably what they plotted was an assassination at that time. And so someone informs Jesus of the danger. And he then leaves because it's not time yet for him to give himself over to death on our tree of division. But the course of events towards Jesus' death are now set into an unstoppable motion at this point. The tone of Matthew has completely changed, and as Jesus leaves, the crowd follows him, and Jesus, he ministers to them while still attempting to avoid the spotlight of celebrityism. As the Pharisees push for direct conflict, Jesus backs away. But not in defeat, because his ministry still continues. And he says, I am in control of when you will kill me. I am in control of when I will give myself up. So I don't retreat because I don't have control. I continue my ministry under control. And as the leaders of Israel have now drawn a line between us and them, between the Jewish leadership and them, Jesus and his disciples, Matthew picks up his thread through his gospel of Gentile inclusion. Matthew 12:17-18 says, this was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim judgment to the Gentiles. It is here that Matthew says Isaiah is fulfilled, that Jesus is God's only Son and will bring judgment and hope to the Gentiles. So Jesus accepts the initiation of his rejection from Israel. He leaves in peace. Matthew continues on with Isaiah to point out that this fulfillment, this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah that the Son of God will neither go quarreling or screaming in the streets. He will not go about accosting people. As we considered a few weeks ago, the Son of God does not exemplify abrasiveness. It'd be nice today if a few people in the church, in America and around the world, pick this idea up. As we're in this greater section on discovering the person of Jesus, I want to pay attention to what we learn about who he is in these lines of Matthew 12:20. It says, he will not break a crushed reed or smother a smoldering wick. In the crushed reed, we see someone who's been damaged. And it says that Jesus will not take the damaged and complete breaking them. And on the next line, we might need a little explaining in our electrical age. Back in the time of Jesus, they used oil lamps with a wick for light. And sometimes the wick gets frayed and tattered so that it puts out some light. But it's also putting out smoke. And sometimes the wick gets frayed and tattered. And the light then puts out less light than is ideal. And it has a whole bunch of junk with the light. It has a whole bunch of polluting smoke that accompanies this light that is less than what we would hope. Sometimes the light is a little faint red glow, and it's 99% smoke. But Matthew says that in Jesus' patience and love, Jesus will not come at us to kill off the light in us, no matter how poorly we're shining. Jesus will not kill off whatever little light we're struggling to share, no matter how much we also cloud and pollute the world around us. When we are trying, Jesus does not smack us down and say, you're doing a horrible job. He does not smother our light, no matter how small it might be. He doesn't smother it under criticisms of how much we're polluting the air, and he just wants us to stop. It's sad that the church at large tends to stomp on smoldering wicks that are simply doing their best. They're doing their best with the little light they have, despite whatever also pollution they have in their lives. Most recently, I've enjoyed as Russell Brand has been going on this journey into Christianity, and he got baptized, and it made headlines, and I've enjoyed following him. However, not everyone has enjoyed the light of God in Russell. They've instead attacked him and risked smothering out what little light we may judge him as having, because they say there's a whole lot of smoke in there, so let's just stomp out the light. Jesus doesn't do this. Matthew wants us to know that Jesus is not abrasive. Jesus does not break us when we're damaged. Jesus doesn't smother us when our light is small, when our light is poor, when our light is clouded. Jesus is like this as a person because Jesus is filled with the Spirit of God. And God is like this. So therefore, Jesus is like this. How long will Jesus give his love and patience to such people who pollute the world and who are damaged? How long will Jesus bear with us? Matthew 12:20 goes on to say, he will be merciful until he brings justice to victory. Matthew 12:18, it quoted Isaiah that Jesus has come to proclaim judgment to the Gentiles. Often we think of judgment as punishment, but judgment is good in many ways. As a teenager, I submitted oil paintings to the Oregon State Fair, and I was judged worthy of ribbons. Judgment is not simply negative as we often take it. Some translations will say justice, but it is actually Jesus' judgment that we're to understand here. And the victory of Jesus' judgment happens at the end of time. In other words, Jesus will be merciful. He will be loving and patient with all those who are damaged and all those who are polluting while they have a little itty bitty piece of light in them. He will be loving and patient with them for all of time. And then much of the church at large says, yeah, because at the end of time is when he drops the sledgehammer of pain that he's been hiding behind his back. And the answer is no, because we go on to the next verse. Matthew 12:21, it begins, and in his name. The Greek word translated name here, actually, it refers to a person or even a person's reputation. We've turned the word Jesus into a mystical incantation. And then we miss what it really means. To speak of the name of Jesus refers to who he is. His reputation is the embodiment of our loving and tranquil God. So when we speak the name of Jesus, it isn't just a magical word. When I see my Hispanic friend and I shout, hey, Jesus, the demons don't suddenly run because I said Jesus. When we refer to the name of Jesus and the power that it is not a spell that comes with the word. People often speak the sounds of the letters J-E-S-U-S. They speak these sounds believing there is simply something magical that happens with those. And then they wait for something to happen. They have not actually brought Jesus, the person, into the situation with his gentleness, his love, his introduction to the divine arms of the Father. The divine arms that want to hug us. It's the name Jesus that then calls to mind and brings into the situation the person. It is the name Jesus that turns us to the reassurance of the reputation of who Jesus is. It's the realization of who God is made clear by Jesus. So despite the negative manner in which we often place final judgment as a punishing time, we read, as we look at 12:21 completely, and in Jesus' name, in Jesus' person, and in his reputation, the Gentiles find hope. Jesus' judgment is going to be proclaimed to the Gentiles as Israel rejects him. This is merciful judgment that the Jews are getting angry with, and they do not want to put in the work to even understand it. But Matthew says the Gentiles will catch on. The Gentiles will hear of how Jesus will judge everything at the end of time. And they will look at his reputation as he reveals the Father. And they will get to know him as the one who is too merciful. He is so merciful that he proclaims forgiveness to his own murderers. And the Gentiles will put two and two together and they will say, this guy is going to judge me in the end. And this is what this guy is like. He forgives even his murderers. Well, in that case, I can put two and two together. And I look forward to the day that this guy judges me. The kids are going to return as I show us again Matthew 12, 19 to 20. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a damaged reed. He will not smother or quench a person who has the smallest bit of light in them. He will remain merciful until he brings his justice, his final judgment to victory. We read in here that Jesus is not abrasive. And Jesus' mercy for the damaged and for the struggling, it only stops at final judgment. Because it is in final judgment that the damaged and the struggling will be made whole. They will no longer need that mercy and patience for where they fail. Because they will be made whole in Jesus' merciful judgment. We'll have Nate come up here and we'll come to our last song of worship as we consider just a bit of who we have learned Jesus to be in these last few weeks. Jesus is the one of lightness and ease. If it ain't light, it ain't right. Jesus is the one who reveals the God of tranquility and smiling countenance. Jesus is the one of leniency who breaks laws for mercy. Jesus is the one who is despised by the critical. Jesus is the one whose judgment we hope for and we look forward to. Because Jesus will judge as he lived. So we move forward in life, confident in Jesus' name, confident in Jesus' person and reputation that we do not need to hide behind a tree. And while the judgmental will despise what they see take place on Judgment Day, they will despise it just as they despise Jesus' ministry on earth. While the judgmental will despise it, we hold out great expectations for it. We will revel in Jesus' final judgment because it will be glorious and it will be merciful.